B&A Railroad came into Houlton in late 1893. This clock was purchased and it hung on the wall for the entire time that we had a passenger station here in Houlton for the B&A, and after the station closed, Glenn Ingram acquired the clock, and later Bill Cummings of the West End Drugstore was able to acquire it from Glenn. I understand he had to trade another very special piece that Bill had. Bill had to trade to Glenn to get this clock, and Bill's daughter Lois several years ago donated it to the museum, and we're very, very grateful to have it. By the Friends and Needles Quilting Club of Houlton in our bicentennial year of 2007. Not every item in a museum has to be really old. Plus, we are an art museum, and this clearly is a piece of art. Someday it will be an antique, but for now it's clearly a work of art. Most parades in Houlton in the period between the Civil War and World War I were led by military units, and the head of those military units almost always was a man by the name of Blackhawk Putnam. Now, Blackhawk Putnam was the son of John Varnum Putnam, and he was named for a Midwestern native chief. Blackhawk had the good fortune of marrying Jerusha Snell. The Snell house was named after her father, Luther Snell. And as you can see here, if you were well-to-do, you could have a large oil painting done of you. And that's one of the biggest ones I've seen. Now, we have a picture of Blackhawk in his later years. We also have a picture of Blackhawk on a horse, and ironically, contrary to all reports, it's a black horse. Apparently, his white horse wasn't available or didn't last forever. Now, Blackhawk lived in the Putnam Mansion, which we now often refer to as the Blackhawk Putnam Tavern, which was built in 1813 after Aaron Putnam's house had burned the same year his dam got washed out. It wasn't a good year for Aaron Putnam. This is believed to be the oldest frame structure north of Old Town still in existence. Now, many will ask, what about, for example, the Martin House in Madawaska? The Martin House in Madawaska is older than the Blackhawk Putnam Tavern, but it wasn't built on a frame. The Acadians brought with them their knowledge of shipbuilding, and they actually built the Martin House and a number of other of the oldest structures up in the St. John Valley based on an inverted ship keel. They understood just how strong a ship's keel had to be, and they knew if they turned it upside down, it would carry those extremely heavy snow loads. Smart people. This is probably the greatest piece that we have in our museum. This is the corner hutch that was in the family of Aaron Putnam. Perhaps it may have even been his mother, Lydia Trask Putnam. We know that the piece was made in the late 1700s in western Massachusetts. We know that there's a known maker in Brewster, Mass. Who used a lock which is identical to the lock on this piece in a desk that dated to 1765. It also has been authenticated by an expert on New England furniture from Connecticut, who is a great-grandson of Governor Llewellyn Powers. So we know this is a real deal, but we knew that even before because of the provenance. This was in the Putnam family from when they came up to the New Salem Academy grant. And it would have had to have been very well wrapped in order to have survived the journey. It would have had to have been brought up through Loyalist New Brunswick up the St. John River, and had they seen the 13 panes of glass on the front of the cabinet and recognized the significance of those 13 rebel American colonies, probably there would not be as many panes of glass that are original that survive to this date. Great piece. One of the favorites when we do tours here for school children, a very, very early Edison light bulb. And as we always say, it still works. Someday that's not going to be true. We don't leave it on for very long because it gets very hot very quickly. The room that we're in obviously was built to be a water closet. This house was rebuilt after the Great Fire of 1902, and not only did it have electricity, but it also had running water and flush toilets. And that was a tremendous benefit, especially to the servants who previously had to empty all of those water buckets that had accumulated from the night before by the family. So, hooray for running water and flush toilets. Rivaling with the very best paintings that we have here certainly has to be this painting that's before us. This painting was done by Joseph Cummings Chase of Skowhegan, a very high second-tier artist. You had to have some money in the family to do a picture like this, a painting. Arba was the son of Cyrus Powers, who died relatively young, but he had the good fortune and the wisdom to marry Malachi Doyle's daughter. And the money in that side of the family was clearly down from the Doyles. Malachi Doyle was one of the great entrepreneurs of early Houlton. He would buy properties and let them out at interest so that you had a very low payment, but it took a long time to pay it off. And he discovered what every bank knows now: the longer you hold the loan, the more money you make on it. And he did extremely well. And he had only the one child, the daughter. So that money flowed down to their son, pictured here, Arba. Now Arba went to New York, and he was made a little bit as an actor, but primarily it was the Powers and the Doyle money. But this painting was done, and it hung in the rotunda of the State House for 80 years. About 20 years ago, they got to looking around at the 160 roughly men who hung on the walls of the State House, and the 5 women. And of the 5 women, 3 were governor's wives. They had no greater claim. And 1 was a dancer. We're not quite sure just how that worked out. Somebody liked her, obviously. And the other, very rightfully so, was Margaret Chase Smith. So if we're going to put more women up on the wall, somebody's got to come down. So, how did he get up there in the first place? So they looked back and found out who he was. His great claim to fame was behind you. His uncle, Frederick A. Powers, Justice, Maine Supreme Court, and his uncle, Llewellyn A. Powers, Governor of the great state of Maine. Ah, that's where all that power came from. Well, power only went so far because our poor Arba wound up being the very first painting decommissioned and pulled down from the wall to make room for hopefully someone who was much more deserving. There's another footnote to this story. Frederick A. Powers married for the second time one of the Hughes girls from Topsfield and Danforth. Now, that Hughes girl's sister was married to Albert Stetson, the publisher of the Houlton Pioneer. Well, Albert died young, and his widow and the widow's daughter, a gal by the name of Sally, moved in with Judge Powers' widow, and they all lived in the house that would become the Oddfellows Hall on Main Street. Now, when Sally came of age, she married a Navy man and lived a rather modest life, but the money that had passed down from Judge Powers was apparently very well invested, because after Sally died, $4.1 million went to the Maine Community Foundation for scholarships for Aroostook and Washington County students, and an additional amount when the estate was finally settled, bringing the total to over $5 million, which forms a scholarship fund which is given out each year to Washington County and Aroostook County students, and that fund funds scholarships of $5,000 per year for 4 years, $20,000 scholarships. That's a big deal. So, of all the Powers' power and money, some of it is still doing good right here in the county. This is a copy of the day book. We do have the original of Hancock Barracks from 1828 to 1845. Many young graduates of West Point during that period were sent to the most remote outpost, which was Hancock Barracks. It was called a barracks because we could not fortify the disputed territory of northern Maine, so we couldn't build a fort. So instead we built a fort and called it a barracks. Among the many people who went through here, we believe Robert E. Lee went through on a survey team. We know Jeb Magruder, the famous Southern general, was stationed here, and a person who has a very key name in history also served as the adjutant here, and his signature is throughout this book. In the very early 1840s, he would go on to be a Civil War general from Massachusetts, and he was probably best known for his liberal policy of allowing women to follow along behind his camp, and those women were referred to as Hooker's women, and today they are simply referred to by the general's last name. Pictured here in this very large display cabinet, which was made by A.E. Houlton, is a scale model of what Hancock Barracks would have looked like. A.E. Houlton, in 1959, wrote to the National Archives and got a copy of the plans for Hancock Barracks. So we know that this is roughly what the barracks would have looked like when it was an active U.S. military post. A little more artistically done, or I should say a lot more artistically done, on the wall is a rendition of the barracks that was done by our local treasurer, Esther Orr Faulkner, one of Houlton's greatest artists, and we're very, very fortunate that she donated the original of this sketch. It's a watercolor, and it's been reproduced with prints, but this is the original, and we're just absolutely delighted to have it. She was a great artist and a great woman. Down at the bottom here, a couple of our more valuable items. We have a couple of fire brigade buckets. If you can imagine putting out a fire with these buckets, well, this is what they would have. They would have a cistern full of water, and when they would have a fire, everybody would turn out to pass the buckets along a line, and they would stand there and throw buckets of water at the fire. These two are clearly identified as having belonged to Hancock Barracks. They're a combination of wood and leather. They're also individually numbered. A number of years ago, I saw a pair of fire buckets from the Calais Fire Department from roughly the same period on Antiques Roadshow. And they said that those buckets at the time were worth about $15,000. Now, if the Calais Fire Department was worth $15,000, and this is the military outpost on the northern frontier, the disputed territory, in terms of historical significance, we don't put monetary value on items in museums. These are not only a wonderful historical piece, but they're worth some big bucks. As Dr. William Boyd from out Linnaeus served in the Maine Cavalry and captured this Confederate battle flag, which we have had authenticated. Some people will ask, well, it's square. What kind of flag is square? Well, many of the Confederate and Union battle flags actually were square because they tended to get tangled up less. Also, like so many flags of the period, this flag is completely handmade. There is a little dispute as to at what battle on what date it was captured, but it clearly was captured by the 1st Maine Cavalry, and we're very proud that we have this piece here. We know that it symbolizes a number of different things to a number of different people. The reason we display this flag is because it's a historical artifact and nothing more beyond that. It's not a political statement. Captain Blackhawk Putnam, captain of Company E of the 1st Maine Cavalry, which in May of 1862 found itself defending a retreat. Someone gave the order, which everyone denies, to charge up the road toward where the Confederate artillery was. 2 companies of Vermont, 2 companies of Maine cavalry, including Company E, went charging up the road 4 abreast, found that not only was the Confederate artillery up the road, it was actually blocking the road and in the road. And by the time the cavalry units charged up upon it, dust was flying everywhere, and they failed to notice there was a full regiment of about 600 Louisiana infantry in the woods off to their right. The infantry stood up, let loose with a volley. Company E went in with 68 horses. Only 4 survived. Horses were worth more than men at the time, and they were the first thing that the infantry took down. The infantry hated the cavalry, and horses were the first to go down. Blackhawk's horse obviously took a shot because on the way into the horse, it also went through his boot, which we have here, entering on one side and going out the other side, presumably doing considerable damage to his toes at the time. Blackhawk and several of his men wandered in the woods for 5 days before they finally were able to join back up with the rest of the Union forces. Blackhawk came home to Houlton and was presented at the 4th of July parade with the ceremonial cavalry saber that we see on the far left. The saber in the middle is his meat and potatoes sword. That was actually made in Germany, probably purchased through Ames Manufacturing of Chicopee, Mass. But in 1862, Ames couldn't make nearly the number of swords and sabers that were in demand. So they imported some 5,000 swords and sabers from Germany, and this is one of them. There were a lot of questions when we first acquired this, why it was a German sword, and we were able to actually document that the fact that it was German did nothing but add to the provenance. If it had been a Ames from a company formed in 1862, the story might not be correct. So, lovely internet. The sword to the right of the three was actually carried by Dr. George Carey, who donated the funds in his will to build the Carey Library. And that particular sword, when it's removed from the hilt, reveals that it is stamped Tiffany and Company of New York. Everybody wanted those big government contracts. So, and Dr. Carey, being from the family of the first millionaire of the county, could afford the very best. So this was probably just purchased outright. Okay. In this corner we have the actual top of the ventilation cowl off the battleship USS Maine, which was sunk in Havana Harbor in 1898 and started the Spanish-American War. Remember the Maine was a battle cry of the U.S. during the Spanish-American War. We remember it well because we actually have a piece of the USS Maine here that was found in Pensacola, Florida by one of the Berry boys, and he managed to acquire it and bring it home. We're glad he did. These are the three men, sorry ladies, who own this house, along with their lovely wives, of course, during the various periods of its history. The house is known to have burned 3 times. The top picture is of Eben Woodbury. Eben was involved early on in the mail stages coming up from Mattawamkeag on the military road, and he also owned a grocery store and an express company, again staying in that stage moving business, and did very well at it. His daughter married John Donworth, below on the left. Excuse me, that is John McIntyre on the left. To the right is John Donworth, and each of them married daughters of the other. So we have 3 different last names. Eben Woodbury's daughter married Donworth, and Donworth's daughter married McIntyre. So this is sometimes referred to as a McIntyre house, sometimes as a Donworth house. More correctly, it's the Eben Woodbury homestead, this lot, and this house was built for Mr. McIntyre. So it's correctly the McIntyre house, but Postmaster Woodbury has his claim to the lot. He built the first house. Beautiful taffeta silk dress was in the McLaughlin family over in Quebec. Out of that McLaughlin family came Jean McLaughlin Larson of this town, a very well-known woman. She worked with the Houlton Pioneer Times, and this dress is from about 1890, and it is on a child's mannequin, even though it's an adult female dress, because with the 18-inch waistline, it won't fit on an adult mannequin. If we look down on the floor here, we see another 18-inch waistline, again from about 1890. And this gal is Frances London, who, when she was 21 years old, moved into the White House by marrying President Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland had never been married before. He was good friends with Frances's father, and in fact was in the house with Frances's father when Frances was born. How's that for weird? For those who may think that our current president has the youngest wife in relationship to his age, they would be wrong in this case. Frances was 21 and Grover Cleveland was 47, making a difference of 26 years. And Frances holds the record of not only being the youngest First Lady, but also the youngest in relationship to her husband. Behind Frances is the ever-present spinning wheel. Now, this spinning wheel belonged to my great-grandmother and went out to Nevada with some of the carpenters who were interrelated, came back to Houlton, was donated to the museum, and became one of about 8 that we have. Now, it's a beautiful old spinning wheel, and we love you and all that, great Grammy Ruggin, but the problem with spinning wheels is nobody wants to throw them out, and nobody's got room for them. So that's why we have to kind of walk around. To get around the spinning wheel, they're a wonderful old relic, but boy do they take up a lot of room. You're just not going to find a place in your living room to put this, which is why we have 7 more up in the attic. In the far corner is an Acadian flax wheel. And much of the early linen that was used in the town of Houlton came down from the Acadians in the St. John Valley. Flax grew relatively well even with our short season, and they made a lot of linen to sell out of the Acadian farms up in the St. John Valley.